Hello everyone, Andrew from WiZDOM here. And this is the second video in helping your kids get into property. I covered in the first video about sometimes one of the challenges is what type of property to buy, and of course landed at the point where we look at properties with opportunity. What I'd like to do now is start to break down some of the different structures that you can use physically to be able to help your kids get into property. And I thought I'd start with co-ownership. So essentially co-ownership is where yourselves or the parents and the kids would be looking to buy a property together. So if we break down the ownership structure, who would be lending, of course, who would be mortgaging, and then some of the advantages and disadvantages of that structure, hopefully that will be helpful in you guys coming to a decision as to about how you're going to help get your kids into property. So looking first at ownership. So in a co-ownership structure, both the parents and the kids would be involved in the structure. Now, one of the challenges there, of course, is in what percentages. And so will it be a 50-50 arrangement? Will it be an 80-20 arrangement? All the way down to 5% and 95%, which generally speaking is probably the minimum that lenders would look for you to have as a percentage ownership. So if we work that structure through on the board, that would mean that essentially the property itself is going into both names. So from an ownership perspective, all the parties are in on ownership. Again, there might be differences in percentages depending on what the situation is that works for you. Now, in that kind of arrangement, the other thing to consider is, well, who would actually be borrowing? And in a co-ownership, there's not really the ability to be able to separate borrowing for you as parents and, of course, borrowing for you as kids. Now, physically, you could probably do that. You could choose that you would have a loan split for the parents and maybe a loan split for the kids. However, I would want to warn you that when it comes to the actual loan itself, each of those splits are still going to be in all of the people's names. And of course, if that's mum and dad and, you know, one of your children and their partner, well, all four of those names are going to be ending up on the loan as well. So a consideration there is from a loan perspective. So if we look at that being your loan, well, again, all four parties are going to be in on that loan. And similarly, from a security arrangement, it's going to be the same again as well. So if we consider what the mortgage is going to look like, well, of course, the mortgage is going to be on this property up to probably an 80% lend or thereabouts, or whatever you choose is appropriate for you. And of course, as a result of that, because ownership is all four parties, that also means that the mortgage provided is going to be over that property and provided from all parties as well. Now, that's fairly straightforward when it comes to this structure, but in a few other videos, I'll be talking about a few different structures, and why I run through that like I do will start to become obvious. Now, the truth is there are a few advantages and disadvantages when it comes to this particular structure. So I think the key advantages are really around borrowing capacity from a couple of different angles. Firstly, repayment capacity. We often find that when four different individuals come together, depending on their individual circumstances to be fair, but generally speaking, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So what I mean by that is if you looked at the kids' borrowing capacity in their own right, and of course your parents in their own right as well, the reality is that individually, the likelihood is that you could borrow less money than you can as all four of you joined in together. And so from an overall borrowing power perspective, this structure could lead to the fact that you can borrow more from a servicing perspective. Equally, from an overall purchase price perspective, it is likely that you would also be able to have a higher purchase price on the property because really it's two groups of people coming together with deposit as well. So the reality is that the kids have saved up some deposit and of course the parents have saved up the deposit. Well, then the likelihood is that the deposit's going to be larger and maybe be able to get you into a higher purchase price than either party would be able to achieve alone. So they're probably the two real key advantages of this kind of ownership, but it does have quite a few disadvantages. So a significant disadvantage of this particular structure is everyone's on title. And an immediate question is, well, who's going to be living in this property and what does that mean for the other party? So given the fact that this is all about helping kids get into property, the likelihood is the kids are going to be moving into that property. And for them, it would be an owner-occupied property, at least for their proportion of ownership. But for the parents, it's a little bit different. This is actually an investment property. And are they getting a return on that investment property? In other words, are the kids paying rent for half of the value of the property or maybe a half rent? So the parents are getting a return to that. Are they getting nothing out of that, et cetera, et cetera? So probably one of the disadvantages is it's not the cleanest of arrangements, which doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means that it's something that needs to be worked through. And of course, in this kind of situation, you've got to consider, well, how are you going to undo that at some point in the future as well? Are the kids going to buy the parents out? Is the whole property going to be sold? From a sale perspective, it's relatively straightforward. You know, percentage of ownership. Obviously, you would repay the debt, and then the proportion of ownership would follow the proportion of money that comes from the sale. From a kid's perspective, probably could be treated as a principal place of residence as long as it was never used as investment. From a parent's perspective, it will get treated like an investment property, and as a result of that, capital gains tax would be paid, you know, proportionate with their level of ownership and everything else there. So a sale's relatively clean. But if the kids or the parents, you know, would prefer to own the property outright, well, then you're in a situation where you're buying the other party out. And of course, the implication of that is half stamp duty because it's genuinely a sale. So there would be a half stamp duty that would be payable, assuming it was 50-50, or alternately, and of course, then there's a capital gains tax event for the sale of the investment portion if the kids were buying out the parents in future. So as you can see, that arrangement can get a little bit messy. So one of the disadvantages of this structure is when it comes to your future borrowing. So let's assume for a sec that you've gone into this arrangement, you've helped your kids get into property, and now it's time to look at your next investment property. Well, when it comes to bank policy and the way that they deal with this commitment, this liability, is that often they will take 100% of the liability, despite the fact that you don't own all of the property, nor are you solely responsible for that particular debt. Of course, your kids are as well. Unfortunately, bank policy can be a bit disadvantageous when it comes to this, and they will make you liable for 100% of the debt. Now, when you couple that with the fact that potentially you're not getting rental or only 50% rental, you can understand that you end up with 100% of the debt and maybe only 50% of the rental. Now, to be fair, there are some lenders out there who deal with this situation better than that, but it's certainly not the majority. And so what you can find is that when you put an arrangement like this in place and then look to go and do your next investment property, your borrowing capacity could be reduced further than you anticipate it being. Now, does it take away from the advantages of this strategy? Of course not, but they are considerations when it comes to look at this kind of structure. It is a structure that certainly works, and a lot of people have headed down this direction. Personally, I think there's some better structures, which I'll be talking about in future videos, but this is certainly a structure that works. And again, the key advantages here are it may just get you into that better type of property or potentially that higher purchase price in comparison to some of the other structures that we'll look at. So hopefully that's helpful, and you can work through that in your own situation and whether that's suitable for you. I look forward to talking to you soon in future videos, and until then, happy investing and bye.